Everything begins in a very unusual way. The protagonist of the story wakes up in the middle of an alley, completely confused by the situation, and starts walking through the surrounding streets. When he reaches a very busy avenue, he wonders where exactly he is. The people around him, surprised, watch him closely as he passes by. Some whisper among themselves, questioning what a noble would be doing in a place like that and whether he might be acting incognito. The protagonist, for his part, realizes that he understands the language spoken there, but cannot fully grasp the context of their conversations. While a woman is buying fruit, he approaches without hesitation. The vendor and the customer turn toward him, visibly tense, but the protagonist simply greets them naturally and moves on, still confused. He comments to himself that he has never seen coins like those before. Moreover, even though the country seems vast, he cannot figure out where he is. After walking through the city for quite some time, he comes across people of all kinds. He notices a group wearing swords and armor, discussing a labyrinth. The protagonist assumes they are mercenaries, although he does not sense any clear signs that the country is on the verge of war. Curious to gather information, he decides to sell some of his belongings. At that moment, he spots a hunter's shop and decides to go inside. The shopkeeper greets him politely, but becomes nervous upon realizing he is dealing with a noble. The protagonist greets him and asks if he is open for business. The shopkeeper answers yes, though inwardly wondering why a noble would be in his shop. Suddenly, the protagonist says that he would like to sell something, and the shopkeeper replies that he will need to examine the item first. The protagonist then takes out his sword and places it on the counter, while he looks over the merchandise for sale. His eyes stop on a map that he does not recognize at all. As he examines it, he hears the shopkeeper praising the decoration of the sword, saying that its design is impressive and unlike anything he has ever seen. Realizing that he spoke too freely, the shopkeeper apologizes for his lack of manners. The protagonist reassures him, saying that he would not be offended by a simple compliment. He then asks how much the shopkeeper would offer for the sword. The shopkeeper replies that he can pay 200 gold coins. Without hesitation, the protagonist agrees, and a few seconds later, a pile of coins appears on the table. He thanks him, but asks if there is something to store the coins in. The shopkeeper presents several types of coin pouches. Taking advantage of the moment, the protagonist also asks to buy the map hanging on the wall. The shopkeeper agrees, but first asks which pouch he prefers. The protagonist leaves the choice to him, which only makes the man even more nervous. After selecting the accessory, the shopkeeper explains how to store the coins. The protagonist is surprised when he sees it working. Even so, the shopkeeper adds that models with special enchantments are more expensive and have fewer options available. Upon hearing the word magic, the protagonist wonders whether it is very different from sorcery. Soon after, he is seen walking through the streets once again. He notices how similar the atmosphere of that place feels to the country he came from. However, that very similarity also makes him feel as though he does not belong there. Thinking once more about gathering information, he concludes that he needs to find someone willing to help him. Someone unafraid to speak their mind, with at least a decent sense of morality, and clever enough to read between the lines. While he is reflecting on this, a man stops him. The protagonist asks what he wants. The black-haired man simply warns him to avoid that alley. The protagonist thanks him, but as the man turns to leave, he tosses a coin in his direction. The man catches it easily and asks what he wants. The protagonist apologizes, introduces himself as Lisel, and says that he only wants to talk. As he speaks, he drops a few more coins, prompting the man to tell him to follow. They arrive at a bar, where the black-haired man asks the bartender to reserve a table in the back. On the way, Lisel greets the attendant, who also looks at him with curiosity. Once seated, a drink is brought to him. The man asks what Lisel wants to know, but before that, Lisel asks him to introduce himself, since simply exchanging information would be far too boring. He suggests talking about his profession, past relationships, or anything else, just so they can get to know each other better. With little choice, the man says his name is Gil, a lone, rank B adventurer. He has never had a girlfriend and has no intention of having one. He describes himself as a true lone wolf, cold and emotionally detached. Hearing this, Lisel concludes that the armed people he saw in the city are probably adventurers as well. Lisel remarks that even if Gil does not want a relationship, women must certainly not be lacking. Gil replies that Lisel can believe whatever he wants and takes it as a compliment. At that moment, Gil becomes more alert, curious to find out who Lisel really is. As the only rank B adventurer who works alone, he still does not feel intimidated by Lisel's presence. Gil does not know whether Lisel is truly powerful or merely a naive noble with no experience of the world. Lisel takes a sip of his drink and comments that Gil seems quite intelligent, asking if his impression is correct. Gil then asks whether Lisel intends to answer his questions as well. Lisel asks how far his curiosity goes, and Gil replies that he wants to know everything, including the details of Lisel's love life. Lisela begins by saying that he has no job and nothing to prove his status or position in society. As for his history with women, he comments that a true gentleman does not keep memories of such things. Gil does not feel that Lisela is lying, but he also feels that it was not exactly a friendly introduction, to which Lisela replies that it is because Gil did not ask the right questions. Gil tells himself that he does not intend to doubt him or dig deeper into his identity, although he admits to feeling some curiosity. At that point, Lisela suggests getting straight to the point, taking out a map and spreading it out on the table. To begin with, he asks Gil to explain the situation of the region shown on the map. Gil explains that they are in Parteda, the capital of the kingdom of Marcaday, a merchant nation. Cabana, on the other hand, is known as the land of magical minerals. He says that long ago Marcaday and Cabana had several skirmishes, but lately things have calmed down. To Lisel, it is obvious what the merchant nation is doing. Cabana must possess abundant natural resources and large mines. Thus, he asks what Gil thinks of Parteda, the capital. Gil finds the question far too vague and feels a bit lazy about answering. Even so, Lisela says that a brief opinion will be enough. Gil replies that there are good inns, tasty food, and that the jobs are not bad. Moreover, it is a comfortable place for adventurers. This leads Lisel to conclude that many people are constantly coming and going in the capital, which means that almost no one would stand out there. Next, Lisela says that at first he only intended to ask a few questions, but ends up asking for a favor. Gil comments that he agrees since the payment for the information was more than generous, and jokingly asks whether he wants him to be his guide, bodyguard, or simply an accompanying adventurer. Gil is only joking, but the shameless Lisel replies that he wants all of that at the same time. The black-haired man asks him to at least be more discreet, questioning whether that was really his goal. Lisel confirms it, but says that the final decision rests entirely with Gil. Gil sighs and asks how long he intends to hire him. Lisela replies that, for now, it will be just 1 month. During the first few days, Gil will stay with him and explain many things. After that, he will only accompany him when necessary. Gil, of course, has no intention of working for free and asks how much he will be paid for all of this. Lisel shows his negotiating side and asks how much effort Gil is willing to put in. Gil takes it lightly and agrees, asking who Lisel thinks he is talking to. With that, Lisela seals the deal by making his first request. After that, they rent a few rooms so that Lisel has a place to spend the night. Gil sits down and asks whether he will finally explain everything now. Lisel says yes, making it clear that everything he is about to say is absolutely true. Gil believes him. After all, Lisel has nothing to gain by lying. Lisel explains that he arrived in that kingdom knowing nothing, and that he comes from a place that simply does not exist there. He does not know whether everything happened by chance or if it was someone's doing. He remembers talking with a subordinate and suddenly appearing in an alley in that place. Since arriving, he has walked through many parts of the city, and everything is very similar to his homeland. This makes the situation even stranger, as if the world itself were off balance. He says he will speak based on that premise, and that if Gil does not believe him, he can simply leave him there. Gil asks him to continue. Lisela asks whether he believes his story, and the black-haired man replies that it would be far too stupid a lie. Then, dropping the jokes, he calls him Lord Aristocrat and asks him to introduce himself. With no alternative, Lisel reveals that he has just inherited his title, that he is in fact a duke, and that he holds the position of chancellor. Upon hearing this, Gil asks whether that means he is the king's right-hand man. Lisel confirms it, which surprises Gil, since he seems far too young. Lisel adds that his king was so extraordinary that he never made his age seem like an issue. Gil asks whether he cannot return to his own kingdom, and Lisel replies that he does not know. However, he is certain that if problems arise without him, they will find a way to bring him back. Faced with this, Gil asks why Lisel himself does not look for a solution. Lisel admits that it is tempting but prefers to leave it in his king's hands, since that is his specialty. Until then, he decides to treat everything as a vacation and enjoy it. The next day, he wakes up early and knocks on Gil's door. Gil asks whether he wants to go somewhere, and the protagonist replies that he wants to become an adventurer. At first, Gil doubts him, but when he realizes that Lisel is serious, he agrees to accompany him to buy equipment. After that, they head to the guild. Gil explains the basics. Adventurers take on jobs requested by third parties, and the guild acts as an intermediary. They then approach the receptionist, who informs them that the guild master is not present and asks them to return another day. Lisela clarifies that he came to register at the guild. The receptionist, named Stud, asks whether Single Sword did not explain anything. This confuses Lisel. The receptionist then explains that this is the black-haired man's nickname. Gil makes it clear that he did not choose that nickname himself, but setting that aside, the receptionist explains that the guild has the right to refuse government interference, and therefore does not accept registrations from nobles, knights, or the like, asking Lisel to leave. Gil says that is not what he thinks, because that guy is not a noble. The receptionist does not believe him, but Gil insists. With no further objections, the receptionist agrees to proceed. With everything ready, the man introduces himself as Stud, and asks the protagonist to prick his finger with an object. Lisel obeys and sees a drop of blood fall onto a sheet, causing it to begin glowing. After that, he thinks about licking his finger, but Gil immediately stops him and scolds him for being so careless. With everything completed, Stud hands him the guild card and then takes out some books to explain how job requests work. He mentions that the guild provides encyclopedias with information about monsters and plants that may be requested in missions. If any doubts arise, they can be consulted or asked directly at the reception desk. Lisel asks whether these encyclopedias are for sale. Stud replies that they are not, but that they can be consulted for free. He also warns that it is strictly forbidden to remove any book from the guild building. With that said, he takes a small piece of paper and draws a map indicating a bookstore that sells books of all types and specialties. Lisel thanks him and, as a gesture of gratitude, pats his head before leaving. Everyone in the guild is shocked, wondering whether he really just patted the head of the absolute zero. Stud touches his own head, confused, wondering what just happened. 3 days later, we see Lisel reading peacefully. At that moment, Gil knocks on the door and enters the room. Lisel greets him and asks how things went with what he had requested. The black-haired man replies that everything went well and asks whether Lisel does not get tired of reading so much. Gil then picks up a book and reads the first paragraph he finds. Lisel continues the narrative from memory, making it clear that he has already read all those books, and asks whether the reading was enjoyable. Gil comments that, to him, it sounded more like complete nonsense. They then close the books. Lisel notes that it is almost lunchtime, so he suggests they go eat and then stop by the guild afterward. Gil asks whether he finally intends to accept a job, and Lisel confirms it. When they arrive, Lisel greets Stud, who obviously remembers him. After all, how could he forget the noble who patted his head? Lisel sits down and says that he returned to hear the rest of the explanations about how to accept missions. At that moment, another adventurer speaks loudly, giving Gil a strange look, commenting that Single Sword had really fallen off since he wanted to see who had joined the famous adventurer and ended up finding only a delicate young man who looked like a noble. Both Gil and Lisel ignore him, while Stud hands Lisel a list of guild rules. The adventurer continues complaining to Gil, saying that he refused his invitation to team up with a rookie and asking what was going through his head. Gil simply looks at him with disdain and asks who he thinks he is. This obviously irritates the adventurer. Gil makes it clear that he should not talk to him since he does not know him and they are not friends. At that point, the adventurer makes an indecent remark, insinuating whether Lisel was worth it. Coldly, Gil replies that at least Lisel is better than him. Stud and Lisel hear this. Lisel comments that Gil's contract was for 1 month, but that it might be better to end everything right there. Stud also calls the adventurer indecent. Even so, for Lisel, it is a problem that people speak ill of Gil. The adventurer asks what was said. Lisel stands up from his chair, faces him directly, and explains that he and Gil joined forces because they made an agreement. The adventurer calls him arrogant for having bought Single Sword, and now thinking himself important. Lisel asks whether he really believes that Gil would sell himself for a few coins. If that were the case, he challenges him to pay more than he is paying right now, though he doubts he could manage it. This enrages the adventurer, who boasts that he is also a rank B adventurer, just like Gil. Hearing that, Lisel congratulates him. The adventurer starts laughing, thinking he has won the argument. However, Lisel feels deeply irritated that someone of that caliber would dare compare himself to something that, to him, belongs to him, referring to Gil. This causes the adventurer to lose control, draw his sword, and hurl insults. He immediately charges to attack. Stud stands up, but Gil steps forward, blocks the strike, and snaps the opponent's sword in half. The adventurer is left speechless. Then Gil twists his body and delivers a powerful kick, sending him flying into the wall. At that moment, Lisel looks at Stud and realizes that he is about to use magic. Grabbing his wrist, Lisel stops him, reminding him that guild staff cannot get involved in fights between adventurers. Stud cancels the spell and explains that he can only intervene if requested as an arbitrator, though that is not prohibited. Lisel understands and says he was worried about a possible punishment. He then hands over money to cover the repairs to the wall and asks to leave the matter of work for another day, leaving the guild. Back in their rooms, Gil drinks a glass of liquor. He recalls how his body moved on instinct, protecting Lisel without even thinking. He also remembers the adventurer's words about comparing ranks, but above all, the fact that Lisel said he belongs to him. At that, Gil simply laughs, saying that it is not as if he were his knight. In the end, if you made it this far, comment the word world to show that you followed until the end.